Okay, so just quickly before I start, so this is part of the early stage, I think, investment, series that is going on, and primarily today, what I plan to do is take on the part related to the investment process specifically, and a few case studies of what we have learned over the last few years. So just briefly, so that you know where I'm coming from. So I'm a partner at Constellation Blue. We were incubated at Bloom Ventures. Ashish Fafari, I think, took the session yesterday. So we were incubated there back in 2013 and then spun out into a separate entity in a year or so. And now we work, with various early stage funds and startups. So all of these learnings are from there. So just thought, maybe put these across, and if there are any questions, happy to address them. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can, Mithun.
Okay. So I wasn't there on the session yesterday, but I think there were some parts that Ashish covered. So I'll just try and link those and pick that up from there. So essentially, this entire stage of investment, the early stage investment, is an asset class that has come up significantly in the last 10, 15 years. And hopefully with the likes of Zomato IPO, I think it'll only get better. But yes, today it is deemed to be the riskiest class. And there is a lot of interest because it has picked up steam specifically in the last 10 years. So there is an allocation that everyone, could be individuals, wealth management firms, family offices, and of course, then there's venture capital funds and private equity who've always been interested in that. So this is just a broad, sense of what we've generally seen so far. There's this power law curve that Ashish would have spoken to you about yesterday. So essentially, a very small percentage of the investments that venture capital funds or early stage investors make are the ones that actually generate bulk of returns. Now, why or where this becomes important for today's session is that some of these things that I'm covering today, right? If any of those go wrong in these few winners, so the 6% that we're talking about, if something on the technical aspects because of a diligence failing or an investment documentation not being proper go wrong, it has a very significant impact. And we have seen this. So we have seen funds where, their winners struggle because there would be some issue with their share certificate, and there would be some issue with their filings. And we've actually seen exits of acquisition kind go through. It could be a deferred payout till issues are not resolved, or it could be a cut in the payout itself because of indemnity. So these are live scenarios that we've seen, post which, we've always tried to ensure whenever we are educating anyone on the early stage ecosystem, we'd love to highlight these specifically because it's best to avoid these in time. Solving these at a future point are like almost impossible. I'll cover those down the line. This is just to connect it to this power law that we're talking about. So here, just overall from a risk reward perspective, a bulk. So the example that I typically give is, or rather it's covered here as well. There are 30 to 40% of ideas that do not work because investors are betting on very, very early stage ideas. Some of these are not tested. Most of them are not tested actually. And that is what venture is all about, which is why it's high risk, right? So some of them die down, and in the ecosystem that we are in, that is not said to be a bad thing because they're not necessarily dying out because of a founder not being correct or the company not doing well. It's just that the idea did not work maybe. So there are cases of that sort. And venture capital funds overall do ride on 1, 2, 3 winners to kind of ensure that they get all their large returns. These are high burning startups, most of them, and clauses that venture capital funds put in their investment documents become extremely critical to monitor some of these things. I'll come to those in detail a little later when we are covering the next slide. From a funding perspective, each founder or investor, so we come into picture post the decision to invest is made with most of our funds. And what we've realized is that whenever we are on any call with the investor or the startup or together, all of them, the thought process is generally that, if you kind of budget a certain investment, it has to last you, could be 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, or it could be milestone based. But essentially that is how they backwork and ensure that fundraise plans happen. So leaving things to the last minute or leaving it too late, cutting it too fine, sometimes becomes extremely risky. We have seen companies, 1,000+ member employee companies go down to literally 2 crore of balance when their salary cost itself is 6 crore. Right? So those are extremely stressful moments. So it is important that some of these things are planned very well in advance, especially on the funding side for burning startups. Broadly, legal structures. So the VC funds are regulated by SEBI. It is pretty stringent in that sense. Of course, it can be a lot more easier, fund friendly, etc. There's always scope of improvement, but overall, it is regulated by SEBI, and there are certain stringent restrictions put in on who can be an investor, what the minimum investment size is, what the minimum corpus is. So these are the reason why these become institutional in nature is because they go through this test. They go through these checks and balances, and you know that they're reliable. If someone is committing a term sheet to you, you know that this is a term sheet that will go through. You don't have a scenario where half the money may not come in down the line. So in that sense, it is safe for any founder to approach a SEBI registered investor. It is generally, it works like any other mutual fund. The money is pooled from various sources, and then there is a manager who specializes or rather is an expert in startup space, and they're the ones who make all the decisions to invest. There could be key LPs. So LPs are limited partners who are basically the investors in the fund. There could be certain LPs who are contributing, beyond a certain percentage, who would like to be involved in certain investment decisions. So there are some arrangements that we've seen funds enter into, where if there's an investment beyond a certain investment amount, or if you're going in deep in a company more than a certain percentage of the fund, then you need their approval. So there are those kind of checks and balances that these large LPs put in. Overall, the manager basically makes typically a 2% fee. So it's a 220 structure is what it's generally called in the venture ecosystem. So 2% fee year on year, at least for the first 5 or 6 years, till as far as the investment is going on, and that may fall later once the investment period stops. And then there is a carry. A carry is basically a profit share. So far, the fees was what attracted income tax. Carry, of course, attracts income tax for funds. Just recently, this is the last week or last to last week ruling where carry now, there is scope that the GST department, indirect tax department, may apply GST on carry as well, which is not a very favorable decision, of course. There has been multiple flip-flops on this earlier, but this ruling that has come in from a high court has significantly dented at least the confidence from a VC perspective, because carry is more in the nature of capital gain, right? It's a gain that you're making out of the portfolio exits. So still classifying it as a service is something that has not been taken very favorably. Of course, there are discussions going on around that, so we will see where that gets to, but this is just a recent development that I thought I would just highlight here. Stages of funding, I think broadly, so I'll just explain some of these and some key nuances around there. So there is one bootstrapped companies, angel funded companies or friends and family companies that comes in before seed. These are typically non-institutional in nature. There is not too much focus on process, diligence, documentation, investment committee processes. Generally, those kind of things are not there. It is more of investment based on relations that go in. Seed onwards is when institutional investors come in, and that's when the formal process comes in. So each time there's a different process. So at a seed, because there is unlikely that the company has product market fit yet or may not have revenue, the focus areas are different. The diligence that seed investors do is typically on founders, validation of founders. They deep dive significantly on the idea, pros, cons, competitors, how these companies or rather the ideas would have done in other geographies. There's a significant deep dive that happens on that prior to any of these decisions being made. At a Series A, B, C level, the ballgame is a little different. You know that the company product market fit has been established. Now it's all about how you would scale up, how you would compete how you would establish your presence in the market, and how you will keep growing from here onwards. So that could be addition of products, it could be addition of revenue streams, or it could be, going vertical and specializing in the particular product. So then the discussions are all around there, and how companies will grow and scale, and then eventually exit, hopefully. Each stage has its own depth of due diligence or nature of documentation. At a seed, generally we would see that it would not go into too many negotiations, because it would typically be one institutional investor, maybe some angels, and the company. As you go to Series A, B, C, once you have more and more institutional investors, more legal representatives on the on any investment, it keeps getting complex, and documentation keeps getting difficult and time consuming both. So of course I'll come to that a little later. So I think straight away probably jump to the key clauses of a term sheet. So just process wise, before that, where generally we come in as Constellation is after the decision to invest is made. So there are some funds where we are invited to small parts of the IC, which are discussions around terms of investment, and key clauses around there. But other than that, we largely come in post the decision to invest in made, and we take the process from there onwards. So the first step that we typically do is sync up with the investment team or the lead that is making the investment, and get a broad understanding of the company, founders, and there are typically in arriving at a valuation, you would have heard in the session yesterday that there are various factors that go into determining a valuation of the company, and some of these factors are could be key facts and figures on the company. So it could be a key metric that the company is tracking. It could be revenue, it could be employees, it could be customers. So all of these details we typically get before we issue the term sheet from the investors, and as part of our diligence process, we validate each of these to the extent possible, and just report back to the investors if at all. Yeah, I mean, just confirming that this is okay, because a lot of those factors actually go into determining valuations of the company. So it's important to validate the underlying assumptions. So this is a typical term sheet. I think I can share across this presentation a little later if you want to go through this in detail. But what we've done is just covered a few key clauses here, or other few discussion points that we've generally seen. So I'll cover each of these. This is essentially the critical part of the term sheet. The rest of the term sheet is generally just legally. So I'll cover key clauses and how they've generally been used, or what we've seen as discussion points, so that everyone has an idea of what goes through this. So one, I think the first point is tranches. Now we have a mixed bag here, where there are funds that don't really bother tranching out their investment, whereas there are others who prefer tranching for various reasons. At the growth stage, so Series A, B onwards, you would not see it tranching. I mean, we've seen that in very, very rare cases. But at the seed stage, I would say, we've almost seen 30-40% of the deals that we do having tranches. And primarily, I think, most founders, or rather the understanding is that it's done more from a VC perspective to just space out the investment going out and their IRR requirements, but that's not the case. Actually, we have seen various other use cases. So one, no company would need this kind of the full investment immediately, at least at the seed stage. So this is the first time founder who would maybe be handling this kind of money for the first time. So one reason why people put in tranches, investors, is to kind of just bring in some basic discipline that, okay, there is an 18-month plan set. If we're giving you 50%, let's ensure it lasts 6, 7, 8 months, whatever the budget is. And then after that, take the other part. So that brings in some fiscal discipline. That is one reason. Two, we have had various term sheets where we've also seen the second tranche being subject to certain milestones, or second tranche valuation being subject to certain milestones. So that is one, the other area that we've already seen. Again, there the thought process is fairly simple, that there is generally a mismatch in what a founder wants versus what an investor wants to give or can give, right? And how we've seen that get bridged is if let's say a founder says, I want 10 crore and this is my valuation, let's say 50 crore. I just is putting them some numbers, and an investor is not too comfortable saying, I can put in maybe maximum of 6 crore or 7 crore, and this valuation of 50 doesn't seem correct. So there would be a middle ground at times that we would have seen where, okay, 3 crore goes in at a certain valuation. And then if you perform and you actually show me that, yes, things have worked out, then you can get a valuation which is higher for the second tranche. So we've also seen that, again, not too common because it's too complex for an early stage and may not be relevant always, but, we have seen that. So that's on tranches. I'll move to the next one, the instrument. So the standard norm for any institutional investor is to take a small number of equity shares in the company, and bulk of the rest would be preference shares. I'll come to the reason for this. So equity shares today, by way of company law in India, have certain basic rights which no contract or no agreement can override. And these are things like, the right to attend a shareholder meeting in a company, the right to receive any rights issue shares, the rights to receive basic information, so audited financials, those kind of things. So I know some of these may sound theoretical for an unlisted company because you don't really have formal shareholder meetings. There are more general, these are generally paper meetings that happen, but just having this right ensures that, it does, it's a deterrent of some form that it does ensure that you have this no matter what a contract says. Preference shares, primarily 2-3 reasons investors choose to take bulk of the other shares as preference shares. One, company law today in India grants preference shares a liquidation priority over equity. That is one reason. Two, preference shares are convertible in nature. So while the initial preference share conversion is generally 1:1, so 1 equity share for 1 preference, but in India, because of the way the law is, to give effect to clauses like liquidation preference or anti-dilution, which I'll be talking about after this, you really can't do it if you don't have preference shares. So we don't have the flexibility, unlike, let's say, the US, where you can issue shares for free, right? So what essentially a valuation protection or an anti-dilution means is that if at all you do a down round down the line, you have to give me or compensate me for additional shares. Now in India, it's not, from a tax perspective, from a company law perspective, you can't issue shares just like that without any consideration. So the tool that investors use is preference shares, changing the conversion terms of a preference share so that instead of 1:1, now maybe I'll get 1:, let's say 1.2 for every preference share that I hold. So that's how we generally protect for those kind of rights. I'll come to the third one, liquidation preference. A heated, rather not a heated one, but a highly debated clause, and primarily only because there are some investors who take a view that it should not be 1x and 1.5. So liquidation preference or 1.5 or 2, whatever that number is. I'll come to that. Liquidation preference is simply put is that if at all in a distress scenario or an average scenario, it will at least ensure that investors get their capital back. That is the primary reason for a liquidation preference, and we have seen various use cases of this. This actually happening. I'll come to a few examples when we talk about it a little later, but we have seen this happen. The standard norm, or rather 75, 80, 85% of the investors that we've kind of worked with have kind of settled at this position where liquidation preference is 1x. So it's basically 1x of their investment. There are some investors who have very strong views on this being higher and not 1x. So the reason for higher is simple, that there is some time value of money that has that would have gone into the company. There are certain basic hurdle rates that each of these funds have to return to their investors. So the thought process there is that if at all, even if it's a distress sale, given that there was high risk money that was put into the company, they would expect that, you don't return just 1x, but return with a little bit of additional basic returns as well. So which is why they would arrive at a 1.25, 1.5. We have had one-off or rather 2-3 cases in the last 8 years where we've actually seen this number at 2x and 3x. And those are very, very specific cases where these are companies which are being bridged very high risk, that maybe let's say there's an acquisition term sheet, but it may or may not go through. So till such time that you determine whether it will go through or not, the investor said, okay, fine, I'll bridge you for the next 3 months, but I'll get a very high liquidation preference on that. That is the only time where we've seen this number shoot up to 2x or 3x. Back in 2013, 14, we've actually had, this at 2x quite often, but that has gone down significantly. I mean, it's as good as zero almost now in today's day and age. There is another concept of having a distribution waterfall in a liquidation preference. So here we've seen a mixed bag here where it's a 50-50. So what this specifically means is, let's say a company has raised 5 rounds of investment. What a waterfall would say is that the 5th round in the pecking order, the 5th round would be the first to receive money, then the 4th round, 3rd, 2nd, 1st. So that is one way. The other way is that all investors at par, pro rata to what they hold in the company. Where this kind of comes into play is that in a waterfall, if the consideration in a liquidation situation is not sufficient, and let's say it meets only, if there's a waterfall and it meets only the last 2 investors, then the other investors get nothing. So from that perspective, it becomes a little unfair to the other investors, because they would have invested in the company. They're all financial investors at the end of the day, taking this high risk investment, but they end up getting nothing, even though there is some liquidity value that is generated. Whereas if it's all pro rata, it's a simple distribution amongst all financial investors who have a liquidation preference, right, in their respective shareholding ratios, which is generally deemed to be more fair. And that is I think, at least from a trend perspective, the last 2-3 years, we've seen more and more growth companies, growth stage investors move to that, where it's 1x pari passu. I'll move to the next one, valuation protection. So this is essentially downside protection in case there is a down round. Not unseen. It has been seen, especially in today's day and age where valuations are a little aggressive. Of course, you don't see it too often, but any investment documentation will always be for the worst case scenarios or the minority cases that come up. You will otherwise not even pick up an investment document typically if things are all hunky-dory and all well. So valuation protection comes in that stage where if, let's say, I've come in at a higher valuation and down the line, there is a round that happens at a lower valuation, it's essentially compensates the investor who's come in at a high valuation to a certain extent. Now, the reason I'm using the word certain extent is there are 2 ways in which this happens. There is this concept of broad-based weighted average, which I think is the most followed. I think I would say 95% follow this method, and then there's full ratchet. So what full ratchet, I'll come to that first. What full ratchet says is that my investment will be reset to the lower price that you're having at currently. So essentially, it's a slightly harsh clause because the way to see it is, or rather the way people look at it is, whenever you're valuing a company, you are going through a certain process and you are taking that leap of faith that some of these things are fine, and you're arriving at a valuation. It's not like this is being thrown upon you. So now, if the reason why the company didn't do well or didn't manage to raise funds at a higher valuation, it's a risk that everyone had to take. And if that's a risk, then why would you want us to reset the entire valuation for your investment? So that is why full ratchet was not a very popular one. It faced quite a bit of backlash, and some of you can maybe Google Redbus exit back in 2013 or 14. I think there this clause played a very significant role for a certain set of investors. Post that, founders have been very, very cautious on ensuring that it's never full ratchet, but investors have recognized that, and they've generally not put in this anymore. A broad-based weighted average is basically, it's a more reasonable way of resetting your price. It doesn't reset it to the down round altogether. It ascribes weight of the investment that you made in versus the investment that is coming in. Those are the weights that are ascribed to the valuation, and there's a certain small adjustment that happens. So this is more fair, and any founder or investor would be generally okay with this. Founder vesting, this is us moving to the next one. So basically, the way these investments work at the early stages, you are looking at a 5, 6, 7 year sort of life cycle to exit. And when early stage investors are betting on certain ideas, the one or other only key people are the founders, because it is their vision that they're backing. It is the person that they're backing. It is the ability of that person to execute the idea that they're betting on. So it is extremely critical that they be around, which is why this clause generally comes in, founder vesting clause. It basically, there are two ways this happens as well. One is where it is purely contractual. So a founder can continue to hold all the shares that he holds. He can continue to vote towards all of them, but contractually he is agreeing or is bound that technically the right to these vest over a period of time. Now, where this becomes useful, there are certain 3-4 use cases that I've covered in a separate slide, so I'll pick that up at that point. But concept-wise, that is what it refers to, and generally these are tied out to approximately the exit period. It may not be directly tied to the exit period. So very common what we've seen is a 4-year founder vesting, because a 4-year period is sufficient for any company to reach a stage where it is not too dependent or entirely dependent on the founder. That is one. Two, it would have very likely raised maybe 2 or 3 rounds of funding. So from a capital perspective, it would have been sufficiently capitalized as well. And that at that point there would be senior management, there would be KMP. So worst case scenarios, these are always protecting worst case scenarios. So worst case scenarios, after 4 years, if something like this happens, then you can still live with the fact that, okay, fine, the company may not shut down. But if this happens, let's say in year 1 or year 2, then there are very high chances of the company shutting down, or maybe you have to find a replacement. So these kind of clauses come handy at that point in time. I'll come to examples a little later. Pro rata right. So this is generally available to institutional investors, because the way the way institutional investors look at any company is that they look at it over a life cycle. So each fund generally has a reserve ratio. So if they're making an investment at a seed stage, they generally have reserves allocated to each company, saying that at the follow-on we'll play this much, maybe for 1 round, 2 round, 3 rounds, depending on the size and scale of the fund. And that generally these rights come handy in that point in time, that you have a right to maintain your stake at each point in time whenever the company raises funds down the line. So it's a straightforward clause. There has never been any issues that anyone has here. Commercially, things may differ, where founders are trying to protect for dilution or over dilution rather. They may request existing investors to not play the full right, to things like that. So that, that's entirely commercial, and it all depends on how the company scales up and grows. But it's not been a right that has had heartburn overall. A right of first refusal conceptually is basically, if there is any shareholder in the company who's wanting to sell his shares, it allows a holder of a right of first refusal to have the first right on those shares. So there are two concepts: right of first refusal and right of first offer. Right of first refusal is the one that is more common, and what it says is, and use cases is today, if I'm an institutional investor and there are angel investors in the company that came in earlier, they've been there for 3-4 years. They generally don't have holding spans as large as institutional investors, so they would like to sell out. In that case, instead of that going outside to a third party altogether, if you can consolidate, or rather, if as a large investor I have a right to buy those shares out first, then I kind of get them first. The difference between right of first refusal and offer is the discovery of the pricing. So in a right of first refusal, the angel investor discovers the price outside, says that, okay, I have a buyer for, let's say, USD X, and I want to offer it, and the investor can buy it at USD X. And if they don't choose to, then the angel investor can then onwards sell it. In a right of first offer, in the other case, is where you don't really have to go outside. It is purely a mutual discussion where an angel investor comes to, let's say, an institutional guy and says that, okay, I want to sell. They agree upon a certain price, and they kind of sell. And if at all, let's say there is no agreement on that certain price, then the angel investor is free to move out, provided he sells at a price which is higher than what the existing investor was offering. So that is what a right of first offer is, where price discovery in one happens before, in the other, it is where it is a mutual discussion, and if that is not okay, an investor can go out and sell it at a higher price. A tag along right. So this is essentially never really seen practically this being affected, but it's essentially a right which says that if at all there is a scenario where founders are selling out their shares, then the investors would have a right to tag along onto that. So there are two parts in this as well. One is a tag along which is pro rata. So if let's say a founder is selling out 10% of his shares, then all investors would also have a right to sell out 10% of their shares. If a founder is selling out certain shares, which is triggering a change in control altogether in the company, it is in some form, a change in this overall company structure. And because the investors generally bank on the founders, and if founders are no longer there, they would generally say that, we would want to exit entirely first before you actually make this change in control. So that's when a tag along comes in, pro rata to a certain extent. If it is triggering a change in control where founder is losing board control or losing, more than 51% of his shares, or let's say the buyer is getting more than 51% of the company, then in those cases, investors would have a choice to enter, either exit entirely or stay on. But like I said, these are generally there on paper, but in practicality, how these happen is they're generally more of discussions first. You would never have a founder. I mean, there are various other restrictions on founders selling shares. So it generally comes to a discussion point first, and then collectively, if everyone is agreeing to look at opportunities to sell the company, then they would do that. I mean, that's how we've seen practically that go along. Board seats, observers. So this evolves as the company evolves significantly. Institutional investors typically would prefer having board seats, and the reason for having board seats is not generally to be operationally active. It is more it's more of a quarterly board meeting which discusses general updates, tracks business performance overall, and it is generally more focused on the future. So we've had the privilege of being a part of some board meetings in companies, and these are companies where we've had 3 or 4 institutional investors, both seed and growth investors, and the discussions are generally what next. So there is, I would say, probably 10, 15, 20% of board meeting times generally gets spent on the past performance or reflections of the quarter that would have just ended, and the rest of it is entirely towards what next and plans for the future. That includes fundraise, that includes, it could be revenue, it could be key clients, it could be addition of geographies, various of those kinds. But where this evolves is, and just yesterday, in fact, I was having a discussion where there is a founder who has close to 7 or 8 institutional investors now. It's a very strange spot that founder is in, where the investor who came in earliest has a very high stake. The investor who is leading the current round that the founder is raising may not have that much as a stake, but has extreme value add to the company. So very peculiar situation where, with 7, 8 institutional investors on board, you can't at a private limited company have 14, 15, 16 member boards. So what typically happens is investors that are above a certain threshold then have a right to be a part of the board. And these thresholds depend. I mean, they could be anywhere between 5%, 8%, 10%. As the company grows, that keeps changing. So that's how board seats are generally regulated. It is a little, a slightly prestigious, I would say prestigious, or a key, from a founder perspective, very key, that they would not want inordinate large boards. And that has been something that we've seen through and through. And they would want board members who are very value add to the board, because just sitting in the meeting and not being able to question anything, or not helping with the direction that the company should have, it kind of defeats the purpose of a board from a founder perspective. So it is not just a board on paper. There is actual value add and a lot of discussion that happens in these board meetings. An observer is basically someone who can be a part of these board meetings but cannot vote. So like I talked about this threshold, right? So let's say there are 7-8 institutional investors. Now, for the institutional investors, it is extremely critical to be on, at least be a part of these discussions. Now, whether they can vote, not vote, because they're, maybe not having a high stakeholding anymore, that differs. So in those cases, what the general agreement is that you can be observers in these board meetings. There is no voting ability, but you can be a part of all the discussions. Typically, you can also contribute, but your contribution would not be on record anyway. But this is more, each investor brings in their own value add. It could be from a fundraise perspective. It could be from a platform perspective, networking perspective. So founders are generally happy to, have observers or accommodate observers. I'll move to the next one, affirmative rights. Sorry, I'll just do a quick time check. Okay. So affirmative rights is, so again, these are specific veto items is what we typically call them, is where if it's a list of, it could be 15, 20, 25 areas, which are very critical to an investor. And these could be of various kinds. This could be expansion of board, decisions around expansion of board, decisions around exit, decisions around, let's say, starting a new business vertical, or hiring or firing a key employee, or setting up any ESOP scheme, or doing anything that has an impact on the cap table. It could be an acqui-hire, acquisition, merger. So these are specific things which need prior approval from the investors. These are rights specific for that. So you cannot, irrespective of whether the majority of the board approves, doesn't approve, these are areas where you need specific approval from investors. And if it is no communication from investors, is also a deemed no. I mean, they're that critical to any investor. I'll move a little fast because we may be running short on time. There's a few specific case studies I wanted to cover. So exits, these are best effort exit clauses that we've generally seen. Exit obligations, mandatory. Founder personal liabilities for this is something that we've never seen, and that I don't think any investor expects either. A drag along, again, never really seen this being exercised because of the way regulations in India are. Whether this could have been exercised, we've had 1 or 2 cases where investors would have felt the need of exercising a right like this. So what it simply says is that, let's say we waited out 5 years, 6 years for the exit period, and there's still no exit. It allows an investor to go and find an acquirer, buyer, and if the acquirer says that, okay, I can't just acquire your 15%, 20%, I need 100% of the company. What this clause allows is, it allows the 15, 20% investor to drag all the other shareholders such that the acquirer can get 100% of the entity. Now, while this is a clause that every document will have, the practical implementation becomes a little difficult, and we saw that happen just in a recent transaction where there were a couple of rogue investors, rogue in the sense people who were either not happy with the consideration that they were getting, or they just wanted to optimize a little more, or this, it was, too small for them to, give attention to. So those kind of investors had blocked a certain deal altogether, because any acquirer, if let's say there's a listed entity, or if you have a large corporation from outside acquiring, they're very, very peculiar on not having any kind of nonsense on the cap table. They want 100% of the company. They are not okay with even a 98%, a 99%. They don't want any sort of, hassle in their investment. So in those cases, these clauses do come in handy, but extremely tough to regulate rather affect in India. Right? The threshold concept, I think I talked about. So I'll just quickly move to these use cases. So these are a few live things that we have seen in companies or other exits. Liquidation preference. So we have had cases where we have advised or structured where these are not very favorable exits. These are exits that are maybe mid-level, just returning capital back sort. So liquidation preference clauses become extremely critical there from an investor perspective. And they generally, the way it works is whatever returns their 1x, if that's a 1x liq pref, comes first, and then after that, if there's anything left, it goes to the founders or any other equity shareholder. Then founder vesting as a concept where we've seen it used, and this has been a very handy use case in multiple cases actually. So most companies are, two founder companies or three founder companies. Single founder companies are not, I mean, they're there of course, but rare in the sense because you always need, multiple kind of people to manage few of these things. So we've had a few cases where, in a two founder company or a three founder company, a founder chooses to depart. Now that the reasons could be various. It could be a good exit. It could be an exit because of certain clashes. So, it could be various reasons. Now, where this clause kind of comes in handy is now, let's say if you have a CTO that is departing, which is a case that we've actually seen live. A CTO departing, extremely critical to the company, holds a very chunky stake in the company, but is no longer going to be a part of the company. Now, because there was a founder vesting clause that said that, yes, while you hold 30% of the company, this comes to you over 4 years, it doesn't come to you immediately. What that enabled is that person was leaving in 6 months from the investment happening. So technically only 6 months out of the 48 is what he's entitled to. What that allowed the company to do and investors to, and this works in the interest of all founders, investors, everyone, is that to the extent of 6%, 6 months, fine, you keep your shares, no problem. But we will need a replacement CTO, and a CTO for that stage of company, they're not going to be able to afford crazy market salaries. They will have to use some sort of equity compensation. So they actually use the balance that they got from the departing founder to bring in a CTO. Of course, not all of it, because it was a CTO coming from outside. It wasn't a homegrown CTO. So some of it moved to the ESOP pool, some of it went to the existing founder, and some of it went to the incoming CTO. So it becomes very handy in these kind of cases. You can attract talent to replace such departing founder, which otherwise will not happen very easily. Right? Threshold concept. So this is a concept that investors and founders have generally warmed up to now. So this is when you have 3 or 4, let's say, key investors in the company. Now, each investor comes in at a different time. They have their own requirements, and you don't want, at any point in time, nobody would want anyone to become a blocker. So a seed fund could say that, I have a 5-year life cycle or a 10-year life cycle, and I'm in my 6th year, I need an exit. Whereas a growth investor may have come in just like 2 years ago and says that, there's a long way to go for me. So in those cases, there is this concept of thresholds where you generally agree to a 3 out of, so let's say if there's 4 key investors, then you agree to a 3 out of 4 construct where if 3 approve, everyone approves. So where we've seen this handy is exactly in a situation like this. There was an acquisition term sheet that a company had received. Everyone was okay barring one investor. And because that investor, there was no threshold concept in that case that I'm talking to you about. And that investor ended up blocking the entire exit. What happened to the company, etc., is a different, it went on, fortunately, nothing bad happened. But I think what we realized at that point, and rather the investors that we were representing at that point, is that this becomes very critical, to have. So that's one. ROFR, I already kind of talked about, so I'll skip that one. I'll move to a few due diligence cases. Sorry if I'm moving a little fast. I'm just seeing I have quite a bit to cover. So I'll just specifically, so just a one-line summary on this. What we've, or rather context on this is, these are learnings that we have had when we are conducting diligences, and these are learnings where we have seen others conduct diligence where we are representing companies. So it's a combination of all of these. It could be a mixture at seed stage, growth stage, irrespective. So it's just, I'll contextualize as I discuss each of these points. So few focus areas that we generally have seen in case of any diligence, and I think if any of you are going to be in this space or are already in this space, I'm sure some of you may relate to these. So deviations from pre-investment stage discussion, you may not see this too often in seed stage companies because there would not be historical data. But one focus area that we've seen in growth stages, at least, is where valuations are so past performance, past metrics are a very critical piece for valuations at the growth stage. One of them, of course, there are various others, but one of them, but they become more critical than what a seed investment would have, right? Now, in that case, we have seen a very specific focus on the actual positions being mapped to what has been projected to investors earlier. So to put it, I mean, just put a very plain vanilla example on that. If I have, let's say, in course of finalizing my valuation, said that my revenue has grown over the last 2 years in a certain way, or a certain key metric, let's say, number of customers or number of orders has grown at a certain pace. Now, when an investor is discussing this with the founder, they're not really deep diving into actual positions, going into underlying supportings. None of that happens. Where that happens is in the diligence case. So if there is a certain projection of these key metrics and a valuation has been arrived on that, and then at point of diligence, when they do diligence, they realize that no, this is not a correct number. Let's say it's lower and lower by, let's say, 50%. Then we have actually had cases where investors have come back and said that, there was a wrong projection that we were provided, and we had made a valuation based on that, and now we would have to reset it based on this diligence finding. So we've actually had cases where valuations have been reset. So that is one. Two, revenue recognition. SaaS, B2B SaaS has been a big market in India in the last few years, and not only SaaS, there are others as well, where essentially while revenue comes in at one go, but technically the service that is being provided against that revenue is over 12 months. Generally happens in these annual contracts, and this is a big thing that we've seen actually, where we've had a few cases where founders have tried to optimize and say that, no, this is my revenue for the month, right? Now, when you're actually doing diligence, you realize that no, technically, if the contract terminates, let's say in 3 months, you'll have to actually return 9 months back. So it's not your revenue till you've earned it. This is a complete change in accounting policy. So the case that I'm talking to you about, it portrayed a very different picture when they were recognizing all the revenue in 1 month. When we distributed that across the period of service, it showed a very different picture. Fortunately, in that case, that was not a very impactful metric. At that point, it was too small to have an impact on valuation. It was a seed stage company, but it had revenue. So it was okay. But I'm assuming at a growth stage level, this could be critical. The third point, significant deep dive on this. If there are any investment bankers on this call, you would probably have seen this. Each founder generally tracks MISs that are generated from business teams, right? Now, these are system generated MISs, and they don't automatically flow into financials or compliance wise. So what we've always seen is that there is a certain MIS that a founder follows, and then in parallel, there are actual financials running. So we have had in fact, one diligence finding. So fortunately, that was a company initiated diligence where they wanted to get ready for a large growth stage diligence. So they decided that let's do an internal diligence exercise to keep ourselves ready. In that, what we realized is that there was a certain MIS that was coming in from the revenue stream, and there was a certain revenue being booked in financials, and they were not talking to each other. So when we tried to reconcile and deep dive, what we actually came to realize is that in that particular year, there was about 45 lakh of revenue, which had not come into the financials at all. And it was actually due to the company. So what that enabled is that reconciliation enabled the business teams to go to their customers, say that this revenue we had earned, we had kind of booked. We had all the process around this is done. Whatever we had to do to ensure we make this revenue is done, but we have not received this money in the bank. And 45 lakh at that point was actually equivalent to about 3 weeks, 4 weeks of burn for that company, which is significant. And because if not done at that time, if done later, that only magnifies larger and gets even more complex. So some of these things fixed in at that point in time have really helped. And there are significant focuses on this. Going back to the first point around deviation. So it's a simple test that, this is an interesting conversation I had with a Big Four when they were doing a diligence and we were representing the company. So both of us were just chatting and saying that, the approach that we've generally taken is this is the MIS tied up to financials so that that money is actually coming to the bank. It could have either come in the bank or it would have gone to debtors, and you can make an assessment of what sort of working capital cycle they have. How best to validate this further is that has the company paid GST on this? So if I have booked revenue of 100, I have to pay GST on 100. So we've also had cases where financials show a certain revenue, but statutory returns like GST returns may not. Now, why is that? It could be because there is a genuine error. That is one. Two, is there a try to portray a certain revenue, but that may not be certain revenue, which is why people don't pay GST if revenue is not certain. So there are various checks and balances that we put in when we're doing diligence to kind of check on these. Then the next one is customer contracts. So again, in the startup space, one thing that we've seen is they're very lean teams. So if you have a customer that says that, okay, I have to pay you monthly, this much, or there's a certain variable that depending on this variable, your payouts will be spaced out accordingly. Are these actually being translated? So into actually coming in that line. So when you have 1, 2, 3 contracts, it's okay. You can track it, you can keep it mentally and track. But as the company grows, we have had cases where you have like 150, 200 contracts, revenue contracts, customer contracts, and revenue should come in a certain manner, but it's not coming in that way. And it has significant impact. It has a direct impact on cash flow. It has a direct impact on your P&L as a company. So there is a focus area that investors or companies generally have on this as well. I'll try and just skip maybe the smaller ones and move to the other ones. So I'll move to expenses. Again, so deviations is something similar. So, expenses being matched to actual expenses being incurred. That is one. So there are some times where founders have said that, I've already pumped in certain money, I bootstrapped it or put this much money in the company, kind of try and validate all of those facts. That's one. CAC. So these are in growth stage companies, there is a lot of focus on CAC. CAC is basically customer acquisition cost. This may not be relevant for each company, but there are certain companies where this is very relevant. And there essentially how a founder calculates CAC versus how it should generally be calculated. So again, case study here was that there was a certain method being adopted by the company to calculate their CAC. And when we were doing diligence, there were 2 or 3 line items on the expense side, which were, you can even a layman could connect them and say that this cost is only being incurred to acquire customers, but they were not factoring for that in the CAC. And essentially the try there was to show a reduced CAC number that kind of comes out well. But these were diligence adjustments that we saw. We had to change the CAC calculation and we had to arrive at a revised CAC. I'll probably, I've covered some of these, so I'll just skip some. Discount policies, marketing. So again, here, this is very relevant for these GMV companies where, they're high burning, a lot of marketing or discounting expenses. So they show a certain revenue, show a certain expense, and then a very huge discount. So, at the gross level, just revenue minus expense, one may think that, yeah, they're doing well. But then when you realize that the discounts are, really large, the actual P&L is reflecting very differently. So that was one that we had seen there. Professional fees. So interesting case study here we had was, we went through the entire diligence towards the end of receiving data, and we were finalizing our report and just making an assessment of all the professional fees paid. And we realized that there were 2 payments to lawyers, a law firm. What that triggered us is that what were these payments for? Because they were large payments. And that made us, or rather that, got us to ask questions to the company. And finally, we got to know that there was a litigation going on in the company. Now, this is something that ideally someone should have disclosed as part of the diligence process, but the founder in that case had not disclosed it. And, we managed to pick it up from here. And then, of course, some could have material impact, some could not. In this case, it was a large tax litigation where the liability stood about 1.5 crore. For that scale of company, it was pretty large. So it was an important case that we had here. Balance sheet on the balance. So those are more on the P&L sides. Balance sheets, generally 2 areas of focus that I'll talk about. One is the share capital. The other is the loans. So most investors prefer no liabilities on the books, or rather, if at all there are any, please clear them before we come in, because we've had cases where investments of $1 million and liabilities of 1 crore, 2 crore outstanding for previous dues. So the moment you get 7 crore in the company, 2 crore goes out to pay previous liabilities. Now, from an investor perspective, I would have always thought that the 7 crore will be applied for the business going forward. If 2 crore out of that gets wiped out to clear previous liabilities, it becomes a big problem. It becomes a big problem from a cash flow perspective. So that is one discussion, and rather one thing that we've generally seen. And most of these are, previous founder liabilities or founder loans or friends and family loans or previous expense dues that, because of cash not being available, not paid. So technically these should have been paid out, but they're still outstanding. Share capital convert loans, convertible notes. So share capital extremely critical. We have had so the first, if you recollect, the first thing I was talking about around exits. So any defect in issuance of shares, any non-payment of stamp duty on share certificates, the name on the share certificate being wrong, then the share transfer. So if there have been share transfers, if as an investor I've acquired share from an existing shareholder and the share transfer forms are incorrect or stamp duty is not paid, all of these have actually rendered my ownership as void. We have had these cases, and these have hurt really bad in certain exits, where, because in an exit scenario, you would have invested 4 or 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years have passed. An acquirer is doing a diligence and realizes or points out that these are the gaps. And now, if these gaps are pointed out after 5 years, rectifying something 5 years old with regulatories in India is extremely time consuming. It's tough, time consuming, and these exits. There could be a chance where you lose the exit altogether if they say that no, I'm not okay with this, or I'm not okay with waiting 6 months. So few case studies, we've had few investors where their exit consideration was held back in escrow for about 18 months only because there was a defect in the share allotment that they made in the first investment 5 years ago. Till that was not cleared, which took technically about, I think, 13 months to clear, because there was RBI involved, company law involved, penalties involved. Till all of that was not clear, the escrow could not release the money. So this is extremely critical if any of you are advisors or on the investor side. Stamp duty payments, share certificates, title needs to be very clean. Stat compliances, there is a decent focus on this, and largely the focus on the statutory compliances is to ensure that things are right. These don't become red flags other than structure issues. So if there are FDI non-compliant issues or NBFC non-compliant issues. So FDI, for example, does not allow certain, if you have FDI in e-commerce, let's say, that does not allow a certain kind of revenue stream. It does not allow trading. So if there are those sort of red flags from a statutory perspective, then those become red flags, and investors would either have to change the structure altogether or don't invest. But other than that, anything around GST, TDS, labor laws, company law, these are more done to ensure that the discipline is put into the founders. They are extremely critical. You cannot do without them. And then what happens is most companies, at least on these board meetings, shareholder meetings, or tax compliances, they would generally, it would be, maybe last on the priority list. So in diligence, what we try and do is ensure that one, clear everything that is wrong till date, and ensure that the discipline going forward is set. And that is generally a conversation between the investor and the founder. That could mean, outsourcing it to good people or recruiting someone in-house or whatever, but these are extremely critical. The other areas where we have seen this become an issue is when you're anyways tight on cash flows, the first thing that founders do is delay stat payments. Now, the moment you delay statutory payments, interest keeps piling up on that, interest, penalties. And then if there's been a 6-8 month delay, which we've seen happen very often, because that's the easiest thing to delay. You cannot, as a founder, delay employee salaries. You cannot delay vendor payments because your business will stop. What you can delay is tax, because that you can always figure out at a later point in time. Now, that becomes such a large figure that you end up, in a situation where you don't know how to then figure out how to pay that off as well, and becomes a big discussion point with any investor who is helping the company. So that's, I think, broadly on the stat compliances. I've rushed through the last 2 slides, but if there are any questions, I know I've kind of overshot my time, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to address those, take them up now.
So audience, you can put the questions on the chat section.
So the first one, I think, to Prem, why would you pay again? So Prem, this is generally what happens is most investors, right? So if you look at funds, what they want to do is that, or rather, if you look at exit modeling of a fund, the way they model it is, today I enter the company, I want, let's say I get a 15% stake. To deliver a successful outcome, I feel that the company will need this kind of money at this valuations. And eventually, let's say I'll get to a 7% stake, for example. So the way these exit models work is they try and forecast what the company would look like and what my exit would look like. And as an investor, if I would feel that, okay, if I don't put in money at all and my 15% keeps getting diluted each time around happens, then I may not have a very favorable outcome down the line. So in that case, what investors do is they try and maintain as much as they can, which is why these reserve ratios come into picture. Where if companies are doing well, so let's say if I have invested in a company at a $10 million valuation, and this is a company doing really, really well, then when they turn into a unicorn at some point, I would want a decent stake in that company so that I get a good return. So that is the only reason why existing investors will also continue participating. So they're not technically paying for the valuation increase. What they're doing is that the company's value has gone up. There is an external investor coming. As an investor, I have certain reserve ratios and I feel that the company can do better from here on as well. So if I put in money at 10 million and the next round is happening, let's say 30 million, then I've got a 3x bump up to my first investment. But as an investor, if I still feel that this 30 million can become 300 at some point, then I wouldn't mind putting in more money that I would have reserved for the company, which is why this pro rata right kind of comes into picture. I'll move to the next one. Ratio of, okay, amount example. So simple, I'll try put in a simple example form. Let's say I've invested 10 crore in a company. I've got 10% stake in a company. Now there is a scenario where the company is not doing too well. So 10 crore for a 10% is 100 crore valuation. Let's say there is a company is not doing too well and there is an acquirer who's saying that, okay, fine, I'll give you 70 crore to acquire the company. Now, technically, if I distribute 70 crore across the shareholding, then I would only get 10% of that 70 crore, which is 7 crore. What a liquidation preference of 1x ensures is that of the 70 crore, 10 crore has to be mine, not 7 crore. That's the easiest example that I can give you. Then after that 10 crore, whatever is left, that can be distributed amongst the others. I hope that example helps. Please unmute in case there are any questions on that. Ravindran, so after a company acquires, what's the issue? No, it would need. So any board construct change is generally one of the affirmative matters that I talked about. So it is a matter that will need existing investor approval. And as companies grow, in fact, founders end up being the minority on the board. So as companies grow, so what you will see is, a reverse trend happening then as more investors come in on board, each of them have a board seat. As a founder, you may have 2, 3 sort of board seats, right? If you have 5, 6 investors, you will anyways go down to minority. So what then they do is that founders try and ensure that they have a founder reserve matter equivalent, which says that, if there are these 15, 20 decisions, the founder approval is definitely required, right? Just answering your question straight, any increase or addition to the board, yes, it will have to be a collective decision. It is not driven by either of the one. It is always collective. And as founders go into minority, they try and protect themselves in this manner. Gaurav, can you share how ESOP modeling works? I haven't got the exact question, but I'll maybe just spend 2 minutes on ESOP. So ESOPs, it's a fantastic tool that startups use. 3 things that can happen in ESOPs. 1, it ensures you can attract the right talent. 2, retain the right talent. And 3, reward those who have been there. So these are the 3 key objectives of an ESOP. ESOPs, the way they worked is there is a carve out that happens on the cap table that I am allocating, let's say 10% of my company towards ESOPs. And of that 10%, then, depending on the kind of hires, you keep granting options, and these options then again vest. So the way I talked about founder vesting, all employees also go through a vesting where they have to earn out their ESOP. So if I'm granting, let's say, 0.4% to a certain key employee of mine, I'm telling them that each year 0.1% will vest. So technically that person would have to go through 4 years with the company to get the entire 0.4%, and then that becomes his or hers, and they can exercise and become shareholders at whatever point in time. There are certain tax implications at that point. I'm happy to connect separately if you want more details, but just broadly touching upon ESOP here. The next question, I think, what shall be the ideal relation between voting rights and respective shareholding? So the way this is generally 1:1. So my shareholding is equal to my voting rights. The concept of the US concept of having, differential voting rights where likes of, let's say, Mark Zuckerberg still controls the voting on Facebook. That is not very popular here. In fact, that's a concept that just came in 2-3 years ago where company law allowed differential voting rights. But that is, it's still not done in practice. So essentially, it's all 1:1. It's directly proportionate to my shareholding. But like I said, all of these voting areas generally come into picture only for certain routine matters. So let's say if I have a board meeting, then I need a majority of the board to approve. Now, in the way our laws are today, even opening a bank account needs a board resolution, or starting another office needs a board resolution. So these kind of things, what investors are not too bothered about these are very operational. So they simply let it be. On the shareholder voting side, again, investors have those key affirmative rights. So any critical thing goes through that, and any change in auditor or adoption of financials, that is generally approved at a shareholder meeting where all shareholders can participate, and their voting would be 1:1. Amit's question, so do investors also get discounts on pro rata investments? So answer to that is no. Where they get discounts is where, so typical discount structures, if I'm a seed investor, I wouldn't get, and I'm saying that, okay, I have 10% and I have pro rata right to invest and ensure that I'm at 10% even down the line. So there wouldn't be a discount. Where discount comes into picture is, if let's say I'm an existing investor in the company is potentially going to raise a Series A round, but to get an ideal valuation of the Series A, they need certain metrics to work, right? And they need, let's say, 6 more months for that. Now, in these cases, what we've generally seen is that you want an external guy to price the round or price or value the company. So in that case, as an investor, what I'll say is that, okay, fine, here's money to take you through the next 6 months. Given that I'm giving you this money 6 months in advance, and the actual pricing of the round is only happening later, then from a time value of money perspective, give me a discount to the next round valuation. That is my added benefit for investing earlier. So these are generally cases where we've seen discounts get triggered, where there are bridge rounds, or there are rounds where a founder and an investor is not being able to arrive at a valuation, and they're saying that let's get an external validation by a next round altogether. Then this is where that gets triggered, and that applies for safe funding as well, Yogita. And I just saw that question. So safe funding, convert notes, CCPS, convertible at the next round. All of these are different methods, but their objective is all the same.
Great. I don't see any more questions right now.
Sure.
So Mithul, I think we'll just wind up for the day. Thank you so much for the
Sure,
time.
thank you everyone for hearing. And if anyone wants to connect, please feel free to connect. I'm there on LinkedIn, happy to address any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We look forward to be in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.